Hello, everybody, and welcome again to the Risk Matrix video and podcast with James Junkin,
Roll Tide.
Roll Tide, and myself, Dr. Martin. And we're here again to talk about risk as it relates to occupational health and safety and business in general. Today, we're going to talk about the responsibility and role of a respiratory protection program administrator. Something that James and I have been talking about recently, and I think he actually has an article coming out on his LinkedIn next month about this particular topic. So listen up. First, I want to give us a little bit about our sponsor today. This episode of the Risk Matrix, powered by Veriforce, is sponsored by UCPM. UCPM is a specialty wholesale broker and program manager specializing in environmental insurance. Contractors in the Veriforce network can get their contractors' pollution liability insurance through UCPM Environmental Insurance Specialists. UCPM provides expertise and resources with competitive premiums and proper pollution coverage that helps protect your business from environmental claims. Contact your insurance agent and have your agent contact UCPM and save up to 25%. For more information, visit veriforceNetwork.com/offers/UCPM. And I'm going to roll it to you, James. Let's talk about this thing that we've been discussing recently. Respiratory Protection Program administrators. I know you write policies, and that's in the respiratory protection policy. What about it?
Well, respiratory protection became something of interest to everyone during COVID because we were out there putting people in N95 masks and a lot of business cases, some people using cloth masks, whatever. I don't want to turn this into the effectiveness of the cloth mask versus the N95. We may have discussed that in another episode, but that hopefully that's behind us, right?
Yep.
But respiratory protection is something that's challenging for many organizations, and organizations that typically did not wear respiratory protection found themselves challenged with, hey, we're giving someone a respirator, which an N95 by definition is a respirator, right? And
Yep.
so they were confronted with having respiratory programs, fit testing, medical evaluations, things of this nature. And so we started seeing more questions coming up about respiratory protection, in addition to the ones we normally get for those companies that work and workers wear respirators, meaning anything from an N95 mask all the way up to an SCBA in ideal H atmospheres. And what I've found is most safety professionals really have a lack of understanding of what the responsibilities are for the respiratory protection program administrator and what the qualifications are from the respiratory protection program administrator. I bet you've seen that as an IH too.
Yes, and I want to roll it back a little bit and say not just safety professionals, but businesses in general, right? Because some businesses don't have safety professionals, and they, in there it says you have to designate a respiratory protection program administrator, and they throw a name in, and I'm just going to be honest, it's usually the executive assistant, the secretary, the shop guy, I don't know, the president of the company. And what happens, James? Or I mean, I don't know if anything happens, but
Well,
I mean, are they qualified?
let's talk about what you just said there. Many times, companies have a written program. Often that program is either something they copied and pasted from somebody else's program, which we do not recommend,
They
or
copy it right from the standard.
like I've seen people copy the entire standard and call that a policy. That's not a policy. We write 10,000 plus policies a year, and respiratory protection is one of them. The
Right.
things that go in that policy come from what is required under the regulation. Now, I just happen to have the regulation right here, and here's what it says. It says that this paragraph requires the employer to develop and implement a written respiratory protection program with required worksite specific procedures and elements for required respirator use. The program must be administered by a suitably trained program administrator. Now, often what we find in people's policies is either one, somebody's actual name who has left the company 10 years ago, right?
Yep.
Or more
That's one.
commonly, it will say things like HSE director or safety director or safety manager.
Or sometimes they don't even have a safety manager, right? But they're
Absolutely.
saying it's the safety manager.
Absolutely. It says the safety manager. We don't even have that on our organizational chart. Now, when I do assessments of companies and I come across a policy and we're doing this assessment, I'm sitting with their safety designee, whoever that is, director, manager, whatever. Often those people are shocked to learn that they are the respiratory protection program administrator. Okay. They're like, oh, that's me.
It's funny, not funny, right? Funny, not funny.
That's me, bro. I'm supposed to do that.
Sure. What is that? Here's a mask.
So what does suitably trained mean? And let's talk about that for a second. Now, I implore safety professionals to read their policies. Most of the time, they have a policy in their safety quote unquote manual. That's a different discussion. You know, like we say, there's no such thing as safety culture. There's organizational culture. I like to say there's no such thing as a safety manual. There's policies and procedures that support the foundation of your safety management system, right? But I digress. I'll start a rant. We don't have time for rants today.
Well, we do have time for rants, just not this show. Different show.
Right. Most of the time when they have those policies, they're just happy that those policies have passed some pre-qualification review. And a pre-qualification review is not an assessment of the entire program, right? But even if you're good to go in the pre-qualification system, you need to read your policy. And I'm shocked how many times people have policies and procedures that govern critical aspects of their safety management system that they have never read. Okay? That's why we get to that point and they're like, that's me? Yeah, bro, that's you. Well, I didn't know that. The second thing, if you're going to be putting people in respiratory protection, anything from an N95 all the way up to an SCBA, you need to read the respiratory protection standard. Okay?
That's not training.
That's not training.
Doesn't qualify. Okay?
Doesn't qualify you.
Neither does, and I'm probably going to interject something you don't want to hear here. Neither does a degree in safety qualify you to be a respiratory protection program administrator. And we can get to that, or we can wrap it in now.
All right. Well, let's talk. Let me go to this. Let's go back to the standard, but let me finish this thought and we'll plug that in because it's timely and it's appropriate. Okay. Most OSHA standards are boring. If you have trouble with insomnia, hear my words. Get out subpart O machine guarding and read that. If that doesn't put you to sleep, you need to seek professional medical advice. Okay, that's boring. But whoever wrote the respiratory protection standard, they wrote it in a manner that anyone with a 6th grade education can understand. Now, OSHA doesn't have to say anything but once for it to have the force of law. You agree with that?
I agree.
But you'll see in the respiratory protection standard, oftentimes they come back to reemphasize, and this is another portion. We just read you need to be suitably trained, right? Okay. 1910-134C3 for the safety nerds that listen to us says this: the employer shall designate a program administrator who is qualified by appropriate training or experience that is commensurate with the complexity of the program to administer or oversee the respiratory protection program and conduct the required evaluations of the program's effectiveness. Now, back to what you just said. qualified by appropriate training or experience. Now, we're going to set you aside for a minute. You have a doctorate in safety and you're award-winning certified industrial hygienist. I would say that qualifies you by training and experience to administer a respiratory protection program.
Not always, not always. And,
Okay.
and we can get to that.
All right. Now, I have a master's degree in safety. I'm a certified safety professional. I have a master safety professional designation and a bunch of other letters, but none of that individually qualifies me to be the respiratory protection program administrator. I didn't take a single class in my undergrad or graduate school that was called respiratory protection. Okay.
And it's not just about respiratory protection too, when you're looking at who's qualified and trained and experienced. And this is why I was saying not always am I, as a certified industrial hygienist or a doctorate in safety, the person. Because if you're not learned in the hazards for which you are using respiratory protection, you are not appropriate for the task. Now, a lot of these hazards I am, right? But I'm just going to say, if you've never been in a shop situation where welding is performed and you have hexchrome, right? And you don't know anything about hexchrome and you don't know, you might be able to qualify to be the respiratory protection program administrator if you've got help, but not by yourself, right? So you have to be using the appropriate resources in order to help you do that task. So not always am I by myself qualified.
So I think the key word in that standard is complexity of the program. So
yes,
they could have put your common phrase that you love to say, it just depends. Okay. As the hazards increase, so does the complexity of the program increase. Respiratory protection, if you're dealing in, let's say, to me, this is my opinion, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not the IH here, but for me, it's easier to administer a program where we're dealing with H2S because we're going to put them under an SCBA. Okay.
You also were involved in writing the standard. You also have a great deal of experience working in H2S
I do.
Environments, right?
But
and I almost would say
is easy.
But I also would say that you're probably more qualified in that situation than I am.
Well, I don't know about that, but I may have wore more SCBAs than you have, but I don't know.
Well, or worked with the H2S.
Okay? Even though that H2S, extremely deadly at what I call low concentrations, many people call high concentrations. The respirator selection for that is pretty simple. It's an SCBA, right? Or a supplied air respirator with a hose line. Where respiratory protection gets extremely complex is when we start talking about what kind of filter do we need? What kind of cartridge do we need in these air purifying
The change-out schedules.
The change-out schedules, breakthroughs, evaluations of those type things. So just because I've got a degree in safety doesn't mean necessarily I'm qualified to select those type of respirators. Now, let's deal with that word qualified. Dr. Martin, qualified and competent are often used interchangeably in the practice of safety. We say these things all the time, but they have legal definitions.
They do.
So what does qualified mean?
Oh, come on. You're going to put me on the spot. You're the guy who reads from the standard, right?
Well, in general.
In general, right? You have the training or experience to do that task, whatever it is, right? Qualified by degree, certification. Knowledge. Yes.
In a general area.
In a general area. Not in everything, but in that area that the standard.
Let's just get out of respiratory protection for something and deal with something that we've been dealing with recently. Excavation. Okay. Excavation deals with two different types of people, qualified person and a competent person. You have to have a qualified person, right, to design the protection system. So that,
Mooring, trench box, whatever it's going to be, timber piles, whatever.
and that could be up to including an engineer.
Right.
Okay. They're qualified by training, experience, etc. A competent person, by definition, may also have knowledge in these areas, but they have the ability to recognize existing and predictable hazards and take prompt corrective action.
Right. So they have kind of the experience on the site to know what to look for and know that something's going to be a hazard and correct it. Right.
Same thing with scaffold building. You need qualified scaffold builders, people with training and experience that can build the scaffold, but then competent people come by and inspect it, right?
Right.
Qualified means you have training and experience. But to be the program administrator, you need training and experience that is commensurate with the complexity of your program. Now, an N95, people are shocked to learn that that is a respirator.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And they will
we could
argue
get into the COVID discussion again, right? Because us safety people had all kinds of discussions about that when this all was going on. But yes, it is a respirator, and it does serve a purpose for protection from particulates.
It's a particulate respirator with an assigned protection factor of 10. One of the coolest things for a safety nerd, when I first learned this, somebody asked me in a question, a respiratory protection training class I was in offered by OSHA, is an N95 a respirator? By show of hands, I'm like, no, it's not a respirator. It's not tight fitting. You can get it, put it on, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Hey, there's a letter of interpretation. And what's interesting is Ed Folk had written a letter back to the OSHA for a letter of interpretation. This is really cool because if you don't know who Ed Folk is, Ed Folk was the former head of OSHA under the George W. Bush administration. So you got the former head of OSHA writing OSHA as if an N95, the question is, an N95 considered a respirator? And they went through and explained why it is, and it has an assigned protection factor of 10. So that means if I'm giving out N95s as for whatever purpose, the standard doesn't say, oh, only for this right here. It for whatever purpose, if I'm issuing that beyond voluntary use, it's a respirator. That means fit test. That means training. That means medical eval, all the things that go into a respiratory program. Now, can you fit test an N95? Yes. You don't believe me? Go to YouTube and put in fit test 3M N95 and they'll show you how to do it. So the complexities for learning how to do that are not very much, right? But when you get in these cartridge change out schedules, et cetera, and picking the particular respirators, particularly in air purifying situations, cartridge filters, change out schedules, organic vapor, all these things, half mask, full mask, that takes additional training. Now, question to you, where can I go to get that training?
I mean, there are some courses that you can take that are in person, right? I would recommend in person. There might be some online ones but largely that's by experience, and it's by education, like in certified industrial hygiene or whatever. I mean, there is no one course. And you can correct me if your opinion is different, James, but there is no one course that qualifies you to be a respiratory protection program administrator for the specific company that you are working for, right? In general, it can teach you about the regulations. It can teach you about the mechanics of each respirator. It can tell you about change-out schedules and different type of cartridges and all of those things. But if you don't have the knowledge, right, and the experience of working with a particular substance, then you may not be qualified, right? So you tell me, do you agree with that or not?
So I agree with that, and I'm going to add some stuff to it. Two key things that you need to get your hands around if you're going to be the respiratory protection program administrator. Number one, HAZCOM. Safety data sheets are your friend. Okay. The safety data sheet may also include the type respirator and in particular related to the cartridges that you may need or filters you may need in order to protect your workers. All right. So get your hands around HAZCOM. Number two, I'm going to give a shout out to the OSHA training institutes, the OTIs that are out there. They have a course, OSHA 2225, respiratory protection, right? That is a 4 to 5 day course. I haven't taken it in a few years.
I've had it.
Right?
I've had it.
That will give you the training you need from the fundamentals of respiratory protection. How to go about.
Not administration.
It's not administration, but it gives you some training, right? And that training is foundational in you becoming a respiratory protection program administrator, right? So what goes on in those classes? Those classes, they teach you about the hazards, cartridge and filter selection, the use, the care, the limitations, all those things that go into respirator selection. We can't just put everybody in an SCBA under air all the time, right? So when someone says, James, to me, what is your qualification to be a respiratory protection program administrator? One of the first things I show them, here is my documentation from the OSHA Training Institute, OSHA Outreach Center, University of Texas at Arlington, with Department of Labor all over the top of it. It's hard to get. I'm not going to have a lot of questions in the deposition about my qualifications when I put that piece of paper down, combined with 25 years worth of experience and a degree in safety and a designation. It's a combination. And I think that's your point, right? So You've got to decide what the complexities are. Now, who deems you qualified in this? Your company's designating you.
Right.
So your company has to deem whether your qualifications, your employer, are sufficient to the complexities of the program.
So I got to ask here, then you're basically putting the monkeys in charge of the circus, right? I mean, what I'm saying is,
OSHA did. The OSHA, the standard says
okay,
the employer
OSHA's putting monkeys in charge of the circus, right? Because here's the thing: how do you know what you don't know to put somebody in charge of something you don't know about?
I'm just telling you what the standard says.
I know, but I'm just pointing out.
Designate, right?
I'm just pointing out. I'm pointing out that if you don't know what you don't know, then how do you know what you don't know?
It just depends.
It just depends, right?
So in those situations, that's where you as the safety professional need to educate yourself in what the hazards are, what type of respirators we're using. You're probably inheriting a respiratory protection program in process and not building one from scratch. But as a safety professional, you need to recognize what you do know and what you don't know.
And then get that information.
Fill in the gaps, right? Every situation is different. I cannot tell you, you need to go get A, B, C, and that's going to equal D for qualification for your respiratory program, because each one has its own complexities. Example, if I'm putting people in the oil field in SCBAs to work around H2S, then obviously the respiratory protection program administrator, in my opinion, needs to be well versed in H2S and supply their respirators. Could a person who's worked in a fire department and worn SCBAs in hazardous atmospheres for 10 years that went through that, could that be part of their qualification? Absolutely. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that same person has the knowledge, experience, and qualification to go out there and deal with hex chrome. To your point, right?
Right.
Now, as we wrap this up, the second point of the program administrator's responsibilities is this part of the sentence. The employer shall designate a program administrator who is qualified by appropriate training or experience that is commensurate with the complexity of the program to administer or oversee the respiratory protection program. We've covered that part. Then there's a word called and. conduct the required evaluations of programs' effectiveness. And is a conjunction. You remember and?
Yep.
Right.
Means
So
both.
Schoolhouse
this.
Rock. Schoolhouse
Right.
Rocks was great.
Conjunction,
Kids are
junction. What's
missing
your
out.
function?
That's it, baby. Conjunction, junction. What's that function? Hooking up words
and phrases and clauses.
Like and, but, and, or will get you pretty far. So everything on the left of the sentence is as equal important as everything on the right. And conduct the required evaluations of the program's effectiveness. And nobody's doing that.
Right, right.
Okay.
So, I want to say, look, we could go on about this. You're going to come out with an article on this specific topic. You do know a lot about it, and I do think you're qualified to be a respiratory protection program administrator, sometimes more so than I am. But one of the things I want to point out is, one, our listeners just heard us sing together, which never should happen, but wasn't it lovely?
Roll Tide, baby.
Roll Tide, baby. And the other thing is, why do I always say things like, that's like putting the monkeys in charge of the circus? Because people are going to pick up on that, and they're not going to be very happy. But it's kind of wrapping things around and making it very convoluted and hard to follow, because you're basically asking somebody who's not qualified to put somebody in charge that is qualified. And how do you do that, right? How do we do that? And you pointed this out. The safety professional has to be, or the person who's in charge, the management or whatever, needs to educate themselves enough to designate the person, and then the person that's designated, whether that's designating yourself as the safety program manager, right? As the respiratory protection program administrator, or designating somebody else, that then they need to make sure that that person, yourself, has the requisite training, experience, and knowledge, right? You can hire a CIH, you can hire somebody to mentor you, you can take a course in a specific substance, you can ask the manufacturer. I don't want to give shout outs to a lot of manufacturers, but 3M has very qualified people.
Absolutely.
They have a lab that talks about this stuff. Travelers Insurance, I think, is one that's known for really helping you in their lab on how to look at different substances and sample for them and protect against them. So there are resources out there. Look to your insurance company. But if you are that person, you are also responsible for making sure that you are qualified.
Absolutely.
Competent.
Absolutely. And as we kind of wrap this up, Veriforce has launched back last year a respiratory protection training program. That's meant to be an end-user program. In previous episodes, talked about OSHA citations going up and et cetera. One of the most common that is cited by OSHA is training of employees in respiratory protection. Respiratory protection training for employees has to be completed annually. If you don't know that, and you're the respiratory protection program administrator for your company, there's a gap there in knowledge, and you need to tighten that up, right? So hopefully this has been informative. It's kind of down and dirty a little bit today about respiratory protection program administrator. Like Dr. Martin said, I've got an article coming out on LinkedIn. It'll be in February. If you go to my page, James Junkin, whatever, bunch of letters, you will find it posted in my article section, and it will stay there forevermore as a resource to you. But again, thank you everyone for listening in today. We appreciate all of the folks that join us on these podcasts weekly. Your mama wants you to listen to the Risk Matrix every Tuesday. It comes out on Spotify and YouTube.
Hit that LinkedIn, that like button, smash that subscribe button. Put something in the comments, contact James or I on LinkedIn, and listen to this program. We're happy to talk. We're happy to debate. We're happy to be told we're wrong sometimes, maybe. But anyways, thanks for listening to the Risk Matrix, and thanks to our sponsor that powers us, Veriforce, for letting us do this every week. And we'll see you next time.
See you next time. Y'all keep bringing those workers home safe.